Welcome to EPG Padashala. The paper that we are discussing now is 20th century English literature, and the module is on war poets. We will be looking at three war poets. They are Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon and Rupert Brooke. Let's have an introduction to war poetry. War poetry is poetry written during and about the First World War. The First World War, as we all know, was also called the Great War. War poetry is also known as trench poetry. It's a kind of modern poetry which is naturalistic and at the same time painfully realistic. We say it's a kind of modern poetry. There must be some reason for it. Some of these poets that we will be seeing, they all were influenced by Georgian poetry. Some of them were romantics at heart. Now, they were writing during the modern period, during the early part of the 20th century. Now, if we look for modernist traits in their poetry, one may not find it, because these poets were writing in response to something traumatic that happened in Europe. It was the Great War. When you look at the war poets and the kind of poetry they were writing, you would see that it is not at all like the poetry that was being written at that time, Georgian poetry. So it is set in contrast with Georgian poetry. Rupert Brooke, for example, did write poetry in that manner. We need to think about this tradition that we are familiar with when poets did write about war. There were poets who believed or who wrote about war and presented war as something very noble, that it was a noble affair that involved kings and kingdoms and the royalty. The soldiers, the warriors were celebrated. So you have the idea of the happy warrior, a person who was ready to give his life for the country. There are other words for it. Now, this is the happy warrior, let us say, is a kind of euphemism. But then, in plain speech, it might be called jingoism. My country, right or wrong. Now, this was the attitude that was there. And war poetry punctures that. It raises certain basic questions about this. This is what war poetry did. War poetry in that sense was anti-war poetry, and it represented the horror and the pity of war. It dealt with shocking images and language. In fact, war poetry gave a whole lot of words to language. It could be English, it could be any other language for that matter. Certainly, it did contribute a lot to the English language. A word like, we talked about trench poetry. A word like trench is a contribution of war. There are other things that these poets talked about, or these poems talked about. These poems would have or have images of mud, trenches, the stink of death, the total havoc caused by war. Now we will look at some famous war poets. There are quite a few of them. We will list out some names. Rupert Brooke is one, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg, Richard Aldington, Edmund Blunden, Robert Graves, Julian Grenfell, Ivor Gurney, David Jones, Robert Nichols, Herbert Reed, Charles Hamilton Sorley, and of course Edward Thomas. Among all these poets, Rupert Brooke represented the ideal of patriotic and noble sacrifice of war. This is a poet who wrote about war before the First World War. Poets like Wilfred Owen or Sassoon and Rosenberg, they captured the terror and the tragedy of modern warfare. All these were soldier poets. Now, these soldier poets were bound together by their first-hand experience of war. because most of them had participated in the Great War. So it was all these people coming together, and then there was a friendship that they cultivated in the trenches, right there on the battlefield. So it was this that really, they shared a lot of things. They shared the words that they were trying to write down. They read each other's works. Now there are instances of that which we will be looking at. So there was this great friendship perhaps, and then there was this person, the feelings that they had which they tried to communicate. Catherine Rayleigh's 1978 bibliography of English poetry of the First World War has listed about 3,000 war poems by over 2,225 poets who wrote about the war. Now that is an amazing thing. Now we will look at Rupert Brooke. Rupert Brooke established the cult of the soldier poet in England. He was the pioneer of war poetry, who started off, as I said earlier, in the Georgian line. Before we go any further, there's something that I would like to read to you. This is very interesting. Now, these soldier poets, we mentioned the soldier poets were all bound together by their first-hand experience, as I said, of not just the war, of modern industrial warfare. Because with the First World War, you could see the active intervention of technology. Now, one thing that happens with all these wars, the wars that are fought these days, is that you do not see your enemy directly. There's a great distance that separates you. So it's here that the cult of the soldier poet becomes very, very interesting. Now, what did we have when we talk about the intervention of technology in war? This is a question that we have to ask. These wars then led to superhuman inhumanities. It led to immemorial shames. Now, there is a poem that refers to this. It's a poem by Wilfred Owen. There are 3 or 4 lines from Spring Offensive that's there in your e-text, and you might want to take a look at the e-text to read those 4 lines by Wilfred Owen. I would urge you to read it. Rupert Brooke, to come back to Rupert Brooke, he was, as I said, a pioneer of war poetry. Now, what Brooke's poetry at that point was doing was to present a symbol of a mythical pre-war golden age. So this is the soldier poet, the nobility of the soldier, the fact that you fight for a noble or a royal cause. So it was the golden age. And therefore, we find that his poetry suffused with patriotism. It was graceful, it was lyrical. Now, patriotism is something that we always associate with the army, with the soldier. We are using the word soldier again and again, but we are not talking about, we did not use the word army. We do not use the word the military, but it's always the soldier and the soldier poet. I was talking about all this because we come across the word patriotism. Now, who is a patriot? Now, what comes to mind here is the way in which a certain missile in the late part of the 20th century was named the Patriot missile, which is not at all poetic. But then you have Brooke's poetry brimming with patriotism. Now, what are the major works? He has written war sonnets, and there's one particular poem in that war sonnets that's very, very famous. So we will try and perhaps read at least a couple of lines from that. He did live in Tahiti, so there's this collection called Tiare Tahiti, The Great Lover, The Old Vicarage, Grantchester, I Stayed About the Deck, And then there was this collection of letters from America that came out in 1916, and then his letters, Rupert Brooke's letters, came out in 1968. So that gives you some idea of the output, the creative output of Rupert Brooke. If we look for some of the famous poems that he has, we talked about those sonnets that he wrote about war. There's one particular sonnet that's very, very famous, very popular. It's called Peace. It's a very popular sonnet. It reveals Brooke's romantic vision of war. It's a vision unaffected, untouched by actual experience of war. If you have to look for a single poem about war that's very famous, then it is The Soldier. Now, this is a great poem. We will try and see if we can read this poem before we talk about maybe another poem by Brooks. Let's look at that. On Easter Sunday in 1915, Dean ENG preached at St. Paul's, and he read The Soldier. He read this poem, The Soldier, to his congregation, and this is what he said. I'll read out this quotation from him. He said, this is what he announced, that the enthusiasm of a pure and elevated patriotism had never found a nobler expression. The Soldier is perhaps the only poem that contains the first person singular pronoun. I will read out maybe 2 or 3 lines from the poem. It's worth listening. The first lines probably efface the first person, but then there is something else here about this first few lines. I will just read it out to you. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. What Brooke does here is dramatize the tragedy of his own possible death. We've been talking about death, the dead. This is another poem by Brooks, and this speaks about the transforming power of death in battle. We will look at another very important war poet, Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is perhaps the best known of the war poets. He died young, at the age of 25. He was a martyr of the First World War. Wilfred Owen had a long-lasting friendship with Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon was elder to him. This was a long-lasting relationship. Now, when I say long-lasting, it doesn't mean that, one cannot ask, now here is this poet who died very young, how can you have a long-lasting relationship? I think it has to do with the poems that they shared and what the poems did have to say about many, many young people who were participating in the war, and many more who died, who were traumatized, who were shell-shocked by the war. And many of these writers were really shell-shocked and had to be hospitalized and had to come out of that. So this is what we mean by a long-lasting, deep friendship or relationship. Wilfred Owen was very much impressed by Sassoon's trench sketches in his just published book. So there was this great respect that he had for Sassoon. Wilfred Owen's poems are marked by bleak realism. They also talk to you about his indignation, his energy. He was very young. His energy, his compassion, his high technical skills. The images that you have in Owen are very dark, and they were the result of the war front experiences that he had to undergo. There is this underworld in Wilfred Owen. You have this underworld in a poem like A Strange Meeting, for example. Now, this is based on perhaps an incident where he fell into this trench, and it was a descent, as it were, into hell. So this is something, there were some of these experiences that Wilfred Owen did use in his poems. Many of his poems allude to the loss of innocence that comes along with your participation in war. What is it that you gain when you lose innocence? It's not even the innocence and experience kind of structure with which we are familiar. These poems allude to this loss of innocence, but then there is something more, something that's really, really terrifying in these poems. It's not experience, because what you have is a deep sense of disillusionment with a whole lot of things, in particular organized religion, that's reflected in his poems. Religion preaches brotherhood, love for one another, and yet you have all these people fighting, losing limbs, bloodshed, and all this gore, violence. And perhaps this is why there was this great disillusionment with organized religion. Now, these are some of the works of Wilfred Owen. Dulce et decorum est, 1917. His complete poems and fragments were put together and published in 1983, and his letters were collected and published in 1967. I refer to this poem Strange Meeting. Now, this is a poem told from the point of view of the narrator, who attempts to escape the death and the thumping of guns by going down the trenches. It's like a journey into the underworld. And what does he see there? He sees this soldier that he had killed. This is a strange meeting. What is it that you gain when you kill somebody in a battle? What do you get? A poem like Futility, again a very important poem. It does a dissection of the aftermath of war. We talk about history as always something that is written by the victors and not the vanquished. But then, do we get to read about the futility of war, the aftermath of war, the futility and the aftermath of war? Do victors write about the aftermath of war? So this is a question that we have to ask when we look at the works of Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen suffered once from neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is shell shock, and he was hospitalized. And while at the hospital, his doctors advised him not to be dejected, and then he was asked to write and contribute to the hospital magazine. Now there, he published 2 of his poems. The name of the magazine was called The Hydra. Now, he published 2 of his poems there, and there were 4 poems that were published by his friend Siegfried Sassoon in that collection, in that magazine. We now look at the works of Siegfried Sassoon. When we think of Siegfried Sassoon, he probably lived perhaps the longest among all these writers. He lived till 1967, much after, and he lived through the Cold War. Now, when we look at Sassoon's poetry, we would see that they had an unflinching, or he used an unflinching direct language and style. Now, this is what marks Sassoon's poetry. Now, this is again something that influenced the poetry of Wilfred Owen. So, when we talk about Owen and we talk about Sassoon, we cannot talk about them exclusively. He is remembered best for his angry and satirical poems of the First World War. Sassoon's poetry evoked the soul-wrenching, the heart-wrenching terror and brutality of trench warfare. His poetry is characterized by, again, a bleak kind of realism. There was sheer, absolute contempt for war leaders and patriotic cant, and at the same time, he had a lot of compassion towards his comrades, fellow soldiers with arms. He wrote both war poetry and later on, after the war, religious poems. But then we remember Sassoon primarily for his war poems. His religious poems are not all that widely read or popular. So we always try to read him as a war poet. He also achieved fame as a prose writer also. His early works were printed in private and they were all very slim volumes. Even when the war broke out, some of these poems were published. For about 10 years, at least till 1916, these privately printed poems were published. They were minor poems, they were imitative. There are some of these collections that is worth mentioning. The Old Century and 7 More Years. This is one collection. The Weald of Youth, Siegfried's Journey. John Masefield was a major influence in those days. And you have a very clever parody of Masefield's narratives in this book, The Daffodil Murder. He has a 3-volume diaries that were published. He has also published a critical biography of the Victorian novelist and poet George Meredith. He has a trilogy, a semi-autobiographical trilogy called The Complete Memoirs of George Shurston. So this gives you an idea about the output, the creative output of Sassoon. We'll look at very briefly, at least indicate some of the famous Sassoon poems. One poem that comes to mind is Enemies. Enemies is a poem that confronts the questions and the responsibility of killing in war. The question of the responsibility of killing in war. Another poem titled Conscripts mocks the ideals of attractive attitude of the soldiers. We know what conscription is. You are compelled, as it were, to join the army. So the ideals and attractive attitudes of the soldiers. So this is what is interrogated in a poem like Conscripts. There's a third poem that comes to mind. It's titled Attack. Attack gives you facts and details of war. Now, what it does is, as it gives you these details, it asks the public or the reader to accept the reality, the shock of trench warfare. Now, trench warfare is not something that was very familiar or popular with people. And so here is this war poet trying to not exactly introduce, but then trying to show the trauma and the agony through which soldiers live every moment of their life as they battle it out for land or for whatever. Now, these are some of the famous Sassoon poems. Now, to conclude this, the war poets have always tried to show what happens to young people when they go and fight in the name of their nation. So what you have here is a very trenchant critique of the way in which wars are waged. Now, the way in which these wars affect people in psychological terms. Now, this is something that is brought out in war poetry. Now, what war poetry also does is to show how this carnage, as it were, this futile, how this is a very futile exercise and how it goes against perhaps the natural world order, that it ruptures the innate cycle of life and death. And finally, there is one more thing that needs to be kept in mind when we look at war poetry. What is that? These poets, one can say, these poets in their poems were giving us a documentary on war. So it has also a documentary-like quality, and perhaps some of these poems can be read as some kind of a testimony, or they can be read as even testimonials. Now, we have not in this module, we have not analyzed any particular poem in detail. Now, I would urge you, the reason is this, the reason is to urge you to take up these poets and then read some of these poems that have been mentioned in the course of this lecture. And then so that we will be able to think about some of these concerns, some of these issues that they have raised, they did raise during the Great War. Thank you.